So thank you, Sebastian. So this is a slightly odd distributional paper given how people typically think about distribution. We usually think about distributional concerns with taxes over income groups or perhaps over geographic regions within the United States, say, or within the EU. In fact, Sebastian and I have done a number of papers where we've looked at both of those topics. This one is looking more at sort of industry impacts, and there's a long, I don't know if it's a long line, but Larry Goulder and Lance Bovenberg did a paper looking at industry impacts a number of years ago, which I think has been very influential and helpful. So here I'm thinking about the context of a carbon tax within the context of a broader tax reform. The argument you might make is that, well, we've got Republicans and Democrats, each of whom are interested in tax reform, but they can't agree on exactly how to do it. They're negotiating, bargaining. They're $100 billion short. A carbon tax could make up the difference, and so perhaps that's a vehicle for a carbon tax. But stepping back from that, from the political economy of putting together a sort of a package, there's another question, which is if we think about some of the sectors that matter a lot to Congress, and in particularly energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, those sectors that have competitiveness concerns, then the question is, what are you going to do? What can you do within a carbon tax and within a broader tax reform to address those concerns? And so this paper is a paper that was originally written for a whole project at Resources for the Future in the United States for thinking about a carbon tax as an element of tax reform. And it's a very lowbrow paper. It's the end of the day. I think you perhaps have seen enough OLG. Well, we'll see more complicated models, but you get a bit of a break from one. So if we think about the run-up to the Waxman-Markey bill, the bill that passed the House, H.R. 2454, there was a great deal of concern about how to treat those energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors that would presumably, if the United States does carbon pricing and other countries, China does not, India does not, then how do we maintain competitiveness concerns and address leakage concerns? And so they got a lot of attention in the Waxman-Markey bill. In the end, there was an initial allocation of roughly 15% of the allowances freely given to the industry as a transitional device to address these competitiveness concerns. The question is, what could you do under a carbon tax? Now we could step back and ask, well, should there be special treatment for these sectors? And if there should be, if you think there should be, what are the options and how should we assess these? And in particular, when when a carbon tax is discussed, typically people talk about, oh, we should just do a border tax adjustment. We should do similarly to what's been done with the value-added tax. And I've said this myself in previous papers. But I think there are issues with that, both operationally as well as running into difficulties with actually getting it implemented and reducing the risk of too much litigation. So I'm going to talk about another approach to a border tax approach. But let me first start by just focusing on different types of products and what theory tells us with a destination-based carbon tax. For fossil fuels that are consumed in the United States, if we put a carbon tax in place, then we would want to tax those fuels on their carbon content regardless of where those fuels are produced, assuming that they have not been taxed in those countries. So assuming that that's the case, then we would tax them at the border for imported fuels, and that would be easy to do because the carbon content is relatively easy to measure for these fuels. For exported fossil fuels, we would want to provide a rebate for the tax at the border with a border tax adjustment. But more to the point, they should not be subject to tax if they're not being consumed in the country if we have a destination-based tax. For the carbon that is embodied in products that are consumed in the United States, you would want to tax that embodied carbon, and conversely, for the embodied carbon in goods that are exported, you would not want to tax it. So that's what theory tells us we should do with a destination-based carbon tax. Now, if we do a carbon with a border adjustment approach, then the first thing to note is that you would you would want to provide an exemption for the carbon in exported products. But when you read papers about border tax adjustments, this is generally not brought up. It's sort of ignored. The focus is more on the carbon embodied in the products that are brought into the United States. But in principle, you'd want to do it. But the question is how you would do it. That's I think, computationally very difficult. And then for the products that are imported, the embodied carbon, you would want to tax those. And then the question is, well, do you do it to all goods? Do you do it to some goods? And how do you measure the content? And in a previous paper with David Weisbach that we wrote, we argued that you should focus on a very small subset of particularly carbon-intensive sectors. And we argued that the approach that we could take is to measure the carbon content in like domestic products and levy the tax at the border on that small set of imported products at the rate of the domestic content. Now that isn't exactly right, but it addresses some of the price differential that gets created between the U.S. having a carbon price and other countries not having a carbon price, at least on some of those goods. And it doesn't give the right incentive to foreign producers to reduce their carbon emissions for imports. But I'm not sure that a U.S. price would really provide much of an incentive, even if we did it exactly right. I've actually become sort of, in thinking about this issue over time, I've come to the conclusion that this would be administratively quite difficult and likely to be subject to a considerable amount of legal challenge. And we might want to take another approach. And this is the compensation approach, which really mimics what was done in the Waxman-Markey legislation to come up with an analog under a tax-based approach. And so here, the issue is going to be how are we going to treat the embodied carbon products that are consumed in the U.S. And so now the idea is that, of course, for goods that are imported, we will not provide any sort of tax at the border. And then for some sectors in the U.S. who are in highly energy intensive and trade exposed sectors, we would provide some sort of relief. And then the question is, well, which sectors get relief? How do we identify that? And how is the relief provided? And that's what I want to talk about in this paper. But before we do that, I think it's worth just stepping back a moment and asking, do we want to provide compensation? If you do it wrong, you can undercut the carbon price signal, and that will raise the cost of achieving any given desired level of emission reductions. Any kind of compensation you provide reduces the revenue that's available for whether it's deficit reduction or tax reduction. And then there is this argument that goes back to a very nice paper by Lewis Kaplow in 1992, which is a dynamic moral hazard concern, is that if you think about businesses, they face all kinds of risks that they should be self-insuring to some level for, and policy risk is just one more of those risks that they should be taking into consideration. We don't compensate the horse and buggy industry for having lost out to the automobile industry. So the question is, why would we want to do a similar compensation for, say, the coal industry if a carbon policy went into effect? You may want to do it on distributional grounds, but you have to recognize that it comes with a cost. Now, leakage is a concern, though there is debate over the extent of leakage and the concern with leakage. But I think at the end of the day, the argument for compensation is going to be driven less by efficiency and more by distributional or political economy concerns. And certainly the discussion leading up to the Waxman-Markey bill, it was a very important piece of the discussion. Now, this is a public finance conference in part, so we should talk a bit about incidence, tax incidence. And we should, because I think at the end of the day, if we're going to provide any compensation, you would like to match it up in some fashion to who's actually being impacted by the tax. So for example, if you look at how free allowance allocations were given to electric utilities in the EU, only to see that those accrued really to the shareholders in those firms while consumers bore the cost, that seems like a poorly targeted kind of compensation approach. So because these are trade-exposed, trade-sensitive, trade-exposed sectors, presumably there's a high elasticity of demand, so we would not expect the burden of the tax to be flowing forward to consumers, but rather back to factors of production. As we've already had discussion today, one of those factors will be owners of resources, and to the extent that rents can be extracted, that's one possible place. Capital and labor is another, and in particular, I think old capital is certainly a target for sharing the burden of the tax, at least in the short run. Over time, I would think labor would be more so than capital. So the tax I'll look at is a $20 per ton tax. It raises roughly $100 billion before thinking about reductions in other taxes in response to the carbon tax, raising the cost of businesses. And the question is, what do we do with those revenues? I'm going to look at 4 different reforms. One is a targeted credit for the carbon tax on the corporate or personal income tax for firms. And the target is going to be based on the same approach that was taken in the Waxman-Markey bill, which is to identify a few sectors that are energy intensive and trade exposed, and these are the 4 criteria that were used in the Waxman-Markey bill, with the first criteria of high energy and trade intensity being the dominating criterion. Then I'll look at 3 general tax reductions financed in part or whole by a carbon tax, and look at how energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors do relative to the rest of manufacturing. So we could give a credit for the carbon tax to energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. Now, there's 2 problems. One is that if we simply give a credit for their entire carbon tax, then we destroy the price signal, which we certainly don't want to do. Larry Goulder talked earlier today about giving an inframarginal tax credit, and you could do that. There's actually only sufficient tax appetite to credit about 15 to 20% of the carbon tax, meaning that if they took a credit, looking at data that I do in the paper, if you take a credit for more than 20%, it zeroes out their corporate income tax liability, and they've sort of, that's all they can take. I actually think a better approach is an output-based carbon tax credit, which is, again, analogous to what was done in the Waxman-Markey bill. And here the idea is that you have emissions of a particular firm in a particular sector, and we can identify some measure of emissions per value of shipments in that sector, and we can attribute emissions based on their output, their individual output, times this adjustment term, and then give them a credit at the carbon tax rate. And the benefit of this is twofold. The first is that the marginal price of emissions stays at the carbon tax rate, so it provides the right signal. The second benefit of this is that it provides, in effect, an output subsidy, which reduces the cost of the domestically produced product relative to foreign produced goods, which are not subject to the carbon tax, and so reduces that price gap between domestic and foreign goods. And how you set fee is actually a choice variable. This is a stylized distribution of emissions per value of shipments, and firms to the left are highly efficient, very low emissions per dollar of value of shipments. And we have here I have a long right tail of high emissions. So you could set it at the median. That would be one way to do it. But I would argue you'd be better off setting a lower emissions intensity cutoff, say at the 90th percentile. So looking at the performance within a particular sector of the 10%, the top decile of low emissions intensity firms. These are sort of the best practice firms. So if you essentially credit emissions up to that level, it's providing an incentive to all other firms to reduce their emissions towards that level. So I would call that a best practices credit. That it's output-based to address competitiveness concerns. If fee is sufficiently low, we avoid the tax appetite problem, and it does incentivize new investments. So that's one approach for a targeted. If we look at non-targeted approaches, you could do a payroll tax reduction. The problem with a payroll tax reduction is that the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors are not terribly labor-intensive. They're more capital-intensive. And so this is actually not going to benefit the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors relative to manufacturing particularly well. So I just note that, but I won't say much more on that. You could provide an investment incentive That's a third approach, a second non-targeted approach. The problem here is that this is going to benefit new capital to the expense of old capital. And if we think the burden is on old capital, then this is really not the right approach to take either. So let me skip over that. And then the third approach you could take is to reduce corporate income tax rates. And I calculated in the paper that you could reduce corporate income tax rate by as much as 7 to 8 percentage points. And this actually does benefit the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. So these are showing some distributional statistics over the 34 targeted, the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. This is at the 6-digit North American Industrial Classification System for the policy wonks out there who know these things. And what you see is that it reduces taxes by 21% for those energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors as a percentage of income subject to tax, whereas manufacturing as a whole, it only reduces taxes by 8.5%. So reducing corporate income taxes does provide a higher benefit, in effect, to the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors than to other sectors. It doesn't fully compensate them, but it does provide some disproportionate benefits. So to sum up, there are ways that you could address competitiveness issues within within a tax reform context, and I think there are ways you can do it that don't dilute the carbon price signal. An output-based carbon tax credit is one approach. If you do a non-targeted tax reduction, reducing corporate income taxes does provide some disproportionate relief and may allow you to overcome some of the political argument for needing to provide some very specific targeted relief to these sectors. Payroll tax reduction doesn't do that. But I'll just note that here we see yet again the tension between helping one particular sector at the cost of, say, income distributional concerns, because the corporate income tax is going to be the least progressive of the possible reforms that you could be doing, at least among the ones I looked at. And finally, I'll just note in closing that there is a significant efficiency cost to compensating sectors, but you have to balance this cost against the benefits. And I think one of the benefits is that it would be very difficult, at least in the United States, to get a reform through without some sort of treatment. And I think one of the things I think is interesting is here in the EU, where I think we have not seen so specific and overt a kind of effort towards addressing concerns of, really, I'm curious to hear how the EU addresses this concern as well. So with that, I'll stop and thank you.